Welcome to Believing the Word with author and pastor Dan Shunk. This program is a ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
They mistook the gift of free will and of God's hands-off approach. They mistook that for God not caring. That's not the case. When God gives you free will and says, I'm going to let you choose the path you take, don't mistake that for God not caring about what you do. Of course He cares. He wants you to make the right decisions. He wants you to make healthy decisions that's going to help you, that's going to benefit you, that's going to benefit others. But He's a gentleman. He's not going to come in and violate your free will.
Is idolatry just an ancient problem? Gold statues and pagan temples? Or is it something far closer to home? In Ezekiel 8-9, God pulls back the curtain and shows us what He sees, not just on the outside, but in the hidden places. Secret sins, subtle compromises, hearts divided while lips still claim devotion. And what we discover is unsettling. Idolatry isn't just misplaced worship, it's a deep betrayal of God's holiness. These chapters confront us with a sobering truth. What we tolerate, God takes seriously. So the question isn't just what is idolatry, but how bad is it really? And even more, could it be closer to us than we think? Now here's Pastor Dan in the book of Ezekiel as he continues his message, Idolatry's Evil. How bad is it?
Join us today where we left off in the book of Ezekiel. We pick up in Ezekiel chapter 8 and 9 tonight. Interesting, we're kind of in the middle of a section here tonight. There's a three-part message we're doing on idolatry in the book of Ezekiel right now. The whole entire book, the theme of the book is that they shall know that I am God through all of the different things, not just that Ezekiel is doing and speaking and performing, but through what the Lord is doing to Israel in Jerusalem. They will come to know Him through all of these things. That phrase continually comes up in this book dozens and dozens of times. So we are still in the opening sections of the book of Ezekiel. Just a little recap. We came through the first of 5 sections of Ezekiel. It was really just the first 3 chapters, and it was Ezekiel's commission. God called him into the ministry. He had already been taken as a captive into Babylon. He'd been in Babylon for 5 years before the Lord called him and said, I've got a specific mission for you to relay my message to the people of Israel, not just there in Babylon, but even back in the ones that were still back in Judah and Jerusalem. But here we are in the second section. This is a section of messages where Ezekiel is speaking specifically to Israel and Judah, to even more so to the people that are still in Judah and Jerusalem, even more than the Jews that are there in Babylon with him. So we're in this second section, chapter 4 through 24, and then we'll get into these futuristic sections as we go forward. But as we began the second section of the book, in chapter 4 and 5, it was really a broad look at judgment in general. Ezekiel was given this vision of heaven, and he gave a broad view and a broad message to give to Judah about judgment. And then the last time that we were together in chapter 6 and 7, we started this 3-part series specifically addressing the cause of Israel's judgment, and that is their idolatry. That they put other things as more important than the Lord. They made idols, and even in the real sense of physically carving idols. But the ultimate sense of an idol is that you've made something more important than God in your life, and they have done that. And so in chapter 6 and 7, we began to address that in the first of 3 messages about their idolatry. And last time we were together, we looked at, well, what does God desire? What does God want from a people that are idolatrous and into this spiritual adultery? We looked at that in chapter 6 and 7. How does God want us to get rid of idolatry? What changes is God looking for? That's what we dealt with in chapter 6 and 7. Now today, in chapter 8 and 9, this is the second of these 3 parts of this message of idolatry's evil. And today's subject is not just idolatry's evil, but how bad is it? He takes the time in chapter 8 and 9 to describe to Israel just how bad their idolatry is. I think this is important because this is often our problem, right? Is that we say, oh, it's not that bad. right? We look at the sin in our lives and we say, it's just not that bad. It's no big deal. I'm not like that other person. This section 8 and 9 dives deep. It's a behind the scenes look at exactly what's happening in Judah, in Jerusalem, in the temple with their idolatry. And I believe this is the Lord's way of trying to get them to focus on just how bad their sin is. I'll say it again. We've said this before. You cannot accept the good news of salvation and redemption through Jesus Christ unless you first understand the bad news and just how bad it is. If you don't have any idea how bad the sin is, you won't desire the good news. You won't even think you need the good news. You know, who's going to run to the doctor for the antidote if you're not even convinced you have the disease, right? So this is a deep dive into just how bad their idolatry is. And what is the design of that? The design of that is designed to say, you need a cure, don't you? Look how bad it is. You need a cure. And he's trying to drive them to himself as the Savior by getting them to see just how wicked it really is. So these chapters tonight, 8 and 9, we're going to really look at this 4-step progression deeper and deeper into their heart of idolatry and how they've allowed idolatry into their heart. So each step along the way in these chapters, it's a deeper look into what's really happening, and it's just a grosser look at every step on how bad it is. And so let's begin in chapter 8, verse 1. The first step of this idolatry that we're going to see is being exposed is this. The question is, we show the first step of going towards idolatry is that we begin to show respect for false religious items and teachings. You might say, well, I'm not participating in their idolatry. I'm not participating in their false worship, but I allow it around me because, I just don't want to offend them. That happens all the time in our culture, right? People will put up with idolatrous practices, false religious worship around them. And their excuse is, well, I'm not doing it. I just, I don't want to disrespect them, somebody else around me. So I will allow it to be around me. This is where it all begins. And we see that here as chapter 8 opens up in these first 8 verses. So let's take a look here at verse 1 of chapter 8. Now, it happened in the 6th year, on the 5th day of the 6th month, as I was sitting in my house with the elders of Judah sitting before me, that the hand of Lord Yahweh fell on me there. Remember, he's in the Babylonian territories. This is now the year 591 BC. This is now 6 years after he's been taken into Babylon. This is actually a year and a half later from all of the visions that we've been reading about in chapters 1 through 7. So a year and a half has already gone by. This is his second big sort of visit by the Lord. And so chapter 8 begins one really long vision that will last from chapter 8 until the end of chapter 11. So we're doing this message on idolatry here, and we're beginning the second part of this message on idolatry right here in chapter 8. And so this vision that he's having right now is going to last through the second part and through the third part of our messages on idolatry for chapter 8 through 11. That's how long this vision is going to be. There's a lot that the Lord wants to get across to him in this vision. So verse 2. Then I looked, and behold, a likeness as the appearance of one on fire. From his loins and downward, there was the appearance of fire. And from his loins, that is the waist, and upward, the appearance was of brightness, like the gleam of glowing metal. And in verse 3, he sent forth the form of a hand, and he took me by the lock of my head, that's the hair of his head, and the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and heaven, and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem. Now, where was he? He's in Babylon, and he's being taken in a vision. Please remember that. He's not being taken physically. He's being taken spiritually, or he's going to be his body's not going anywhere, but he's taken spiritually to the real Jerusalem on earth to see what's happening in Jerusalem. It's almost like a dream, but the dream is real. When he gets taken to Jerusalem, he's going to see real events. So let me just continue in verse 3. So the Lord picks him up, brings him in visions of God to Jerusalem, where to the entrance of the north gate of the inner court, where the seat of the figure of jealousy, which provokes to jealousy, was located. Now, we don't have much information on this, but it's very, very clear from the context that this figure of jealousy is an idol. It's a statue that was erected at the north gate going into the temple, and it was called the figure of jealousy. Well, that's easy because it's making God jealous. The temple was there for worship to God, and if you're putting anything else in there that would be designed for worship, that's going to provoke God to jealousy, just like it says. Verse 4, and behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the appearance which I saw in the plain, referring to the first visit. Because remember, when he had his first visit from the Lord back in chapter 1 and 2, it says how the glory of the Lord was there with him. So this appearance in verse 2 of this one on fire with the brightness as the gleam of glowing metal, this is the same description that we had of God Almighty back in the first 3 chapters of this book. So God himself will be Ezekiel's tour guide as he takes him in a vision over to Jerusalem. So this is no mere angel, it's God himself that's going to take him over there and show him things in this vision. Remember, it's not a physical removal of Ezekiel back to Jerusalem. It's a spiritual move to go see real things that's happening. And that'll be made even clearer as we get to the end of this vision, which is at the end of chapter 11, verse 24. It says, the Spirit lifted me up and brought me in a vision by the Spirit of God to the exiles in Chaldea. So the vision that I had sent went up and went away from me. So even there at the end of the vision, he makes it clear that he didn't leave Babylonian territory. He just left in a vision, and God showed him real things in real time. He showed him in real time things that were happening back in Jerusalem. He got the cable news of the day. Let me show you what's happening back in Jerusalem, except he physically brought him there. So at this time, it makes this remark here in verse 4 that at this time the glory of the God of Israel was there. This is the Shekinah glory of God that we think about when they first had their tabernacle. Remember, the Shekinah glory of God actually followed Moses and the children of Israel around even in the wilderness wanderings as a pillar of fire at night and the pillar of cloud by day. And we will see this glory of God, this Shekinah glory of God, become very important as Ezekiel continues to talk about the glory of God. The glory filled the tabernacle. We read that back in the book of Exodus chapter 40. And then later that the glory of God filled the temple as Solomon dedicated the temple. But by the end of this vision, we're actually going to see the glory of God is leaving. And is leaving them alone and leaving the temple in Jerusalem altogether. We'll get to that. But keep an eye out for this expression, the glory of God was here or was there. And keep an eye out for that as we go through these next 4 chapters today and next time. Verse 5, then he said to me, Son of man, raise your eyes now towards the north. So I raised my eyes towards the north, and behold, to the north of the altar gate was this figure of jealousy at the entrance. And so, again, I think God calls this the figure of jealousy because it's provoking him to jealousy. And I know I've said this a lot, but I want to make this clear. Jealousy is not a bad word when used the right way. God has the right to be jealous, right? He deserves their worship and our worship. And if we give that to someone else, he has the absolute right to be jealous. In the same way that if somebody is hitting on your wife, you have the absolute right to be jealous and say, what you're doing is wrong. And that is provoking me to jealousy. It's provoking me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at a time to jealousy, okay? Get away, right? So these words, be sure that we understand this. They're not negative just because we can use them in a negative way. So here we see this image at the north gate going into the temple. Now, verse 6, gets into the details. And he said to me, Son of man, are you seeing what they are doing? The great abominations which the house of Israel is doing here, so that I would be far from my sanctuary. But yet you will see still greater abominations. So then in verse 7, he brought me to the entrance of the court. And when I looked, and behold, there was a hole in the wall. And so he said to me in verse 8, Son of man, now dig through the wall. So I dug through the wall, and behold, there was an entrance. Let's make this clear where we're at here. First of all, God brings him in this vision to the temple complex, specifically to the north gate of the temple complex. And as he's coming in that north gate in this vision, here's this idol standing there at the north gate so people can worship this idol on the way in. And again, I say to you, I think there's many people that allowed that idol to stand there thinking, well, we're coming to the temple to worship God, but, we'll allow other people that, maybe they don't worship God, but we'll allow them to have their idols. I'm not worshiping the idol. And we make all kinds of excuses, right? I've heard people use this excuse. I've heard people do sinful things in church and say, well, we're just doing that to attract the non-believers, but we're really going to give them Christ when they get in here, right? And what are they doing? They're attracting people to the temple of God using idolatry, right? I know of a story. There was a story in Maine. There was a guy in Maine that went to Vegas. And in Vegas, he was going to present the gospel, right? And so to present the gospel, he brought people in with a strip show. But he's going to give the gospel. So he's just trying to appeal to them. He's just trying to bring them in. And this was the excuse. That's idolatry. It's idolatry. You're appealing to somebody's nature of wanting to worship and idolize something else. And then you're going to switch bait and give them the gospel? And I believe there's many excuses why people could say, well, we're just allowing this. But, I'm not serving that idol, but we're allowing this. And these things still happen today. And I tell you, watch out for these things in our own hearts, because these are like the gateway drugs. Interesting that it's right there at the gate, right? And this is just step one of their idolatry. It's very easy to look at this as a gateway drug. We use that expression of getting hooked on harder things because of something simple. And I think this is the same type of thing. So we cannot have any devotions that are more precious than God, because that will drive God from us. And didn't he say that exact thing here in verse 6? He said, why are they doing these great abominations, which the house of Israel was doing here, so that I would be far from my sanctuary? These things repel God. They push him off. I think too many times when a Christian is saying, well, I just haven't heard from God. I just don't know what God wants me to do. It might be because you have idols all over your life. You might have other things of more importance in your life. And then when you really are desperate, you cry out to God. And God's like, I don't work that way. I don't work that way. Show actual devotion, and then maybe I'll respond to you. Then maybe I could be near you. But God's not going to hang out in a heart and in a life that has idols all over the place. And he shows that here. Now, we read into verse 7 and verse 8 that after he saw this idol at the north gate, then he begins to say, hey, Ezekiel, I want you to go dig through that wall. Remember, this is a vision, right? So it's almost like, I kind of picture it as, when Jesus in the New Testament, after he was resurrected, he could just show up in places, right? I kind of picture this in the same way. This is a vision. I mean, think of every movie you've ever seen where somebody can walk through walls, and they sort of peek their head through the wall and they're like, whoa, I can actually do that, and they peek their head through the wall. I kind of picture it that way, because this is a vision where God is telling him to look through the wall and see what's happening on the other side. So now remember here in verse 7 and 8, he was at the north gate, and now he's going to go through the wall and look inside the actual court of the temple. And that's what brings us to step 2 here, starting in verse 8 and verse 9, excuse me. So step 1 is that we're just showing this respect for other idols. We just sort of allow it around us. And now here, beginning in verse 9, here's step 2 is it gets worse with our own idolatry. We begin to practice secretly. Oh, you're not proud of it. You're not out there showing everybody your idols and your false worship, but you're doing it in secret. And that's exactly what Ezekiel sees next, beginning in verse 9. Take a look at this. He said to me, this is God who said that to him. God is his tour guide. He said to me, go in and see the evil abominations that they are doing. So I entered and I looked, and behold, every form of creeping thing and beasts and detestable things with all the idols of the house of Israel were carved on the wall all around. This is in the temple court. In verse 11, standing in front of them were 70 elders of the house of Israel, with Jezaniah, the son of Shaphan, standing among them, every man with his censer in his hand and his fragrance of a cloud of incense rising. And in verse 12, then he said to me, Son of man, do you see what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the dark? In the dark, notice that. Each man in the room of his carved images, for they say, Yahweh does not see us. Yahweh has forsaken the land. Now, first of all, they're in the temple. We know this. Who are they? It says they're the 70 elders. They name one of them here, Jezaniah. These 70 elders is actually the beginning of the Jewish Sanhedrin. We read in the New Testament about the Sanhedrin that's run by the high priest. This is the very beginnings of it. Remember, up until this time, up until the Babylonian captivity, Israel was run by what? By the kings. By David and his descendants, right through the kings. But what happened at the second Babylonian captivity? Babylon replaced the kingship and they put a governor in there. The kingship of David and that lineage is done. And so as that puppet governor appointed by Babylon came in here 6 years ago, this group of 70 Jewish leaders began to stand up and began to take the power structure. And so this is the very beginnings of what's called the Jewish Sanhedrin that we read all about in the New Testament. And so this is the 70. We see in here these signs of, first of all, we saw signs of this public allowance of sin at the gate. And now we go inside and we notice that there is greater sins on the inside. I think that's very fascinating that very, very often, if you see signs of allowance of sin on the outside, that means there's much greater sin happening in the dark, in secret, behind closed doors, right? I find that if you find somebody allowing something publicly or speaking something publicly, there's probably something deeper going on in secret that they're not admitting. And we see that. Here's these elders that are running the temple who have this idol up at the gate out front, and inside, what are they doing? They're worshiping all kinds of idols on the inside. All of this issue of frankincense and the fragrance, this is all offering their prayers to these idols. How do you get to this point? How do you get to this point where you stop worshiping the Creator and you begin worshiping the creation? Well, I think there's actually an indication right in the verse of how this happened. Did you see that there in verse 12? God asked Ezekiel in verse 12, he says, what are they doing in the dark? And then he answers the question at the end of verse 12. And he said, they're doing this because they said in their hearts, Yahweh does not see us. Yahweh has forsaken the land. If you live in such a way that you do not believe that God is involved in your life or God is real at all, then that will allow you to do anything you want. You're on your own. And they began to live on their own. They thought that God doesn't care about them. They thought that God was not involved. That we've said this a few times recently, that this is a life of practical atheism. They're living as if there is no God. And the scripture calls that being a fool, to live as if there's no God. They mistook the gift of free will and of God's hands-off approach. They mistook that for God not caring. That's not the case. When God gives you free will and says, I'm going to let you choose the path you take, don't mistake that for God not caring about what you do. Of course he cares. He wants you to make the right decisions. He wants you to make healthy decisions that's going to help you, that's going to benefit you, that's going to benefit others. But he's a gentleman. He's not going to come in and violate your free will. right? He's given us free will. Don't mistake God's standoff approach by saying he doesn't care. Not true. And he says that over and over to them. And so they're doing all of these detestable things in secret, in private. They're not admitting it. But we see it goes deeper and it goes further. And this is a progression of how idolatry begins to affect our hearts. We go to verse 13 now, and it actually goes deeper. This takes us to step 3.
You've been listening to Believing the Word, a ministry of author and pastor Dan Shunk at Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Dan has been teaching through a series in the book of Ezekiel. We'd love to get connected with you and hear about how God is working in your life through this teaching program. You can reach us by phone at 717-500-1102. Again, that number is 717-500-1102. You can also check us out at our website at ccchambersburg.org, where you can learn more about the ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg and find our chapter-by-chapter messages. If you're in the Chambersburg area, we'd love to have you join us Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings on 5121 Coffee Avenue. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with more from the book of Ezekiel. But until then, this has been Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.